Have you ever imagined that life can surprise you, even after 70? That everything that seemed defined, finished, can suddenly gain a completely unexpected new chapter? Most people believe there's an age limit to starting over, to dreaming again, to living experiences that transform everything. But what if I told you that this belief is just an illusion that prevents us from seeing the incredible possibilities that life still holds? At 72, Margaret never imagined that her quiet and predictable routine would be completely turned upside down. She woke up at the same time every day, prepared her breakfast alone, tended to the garden she loved so much, and spent her afternoons reading or watching her favorite shows. It was a simple life without great excitement, but comfortable. The kind of life that many consider appropriate for someone who has lived so much, worked so much, and become so tired. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling that the days repeat themselves, and that the future holds no more significant surprises? But Margaret was about to discover that life doesn't follow predictable scripts, that the universe has a peculiar way of shaking us up just when we think everything is already settled. And what happened to her is so surprising that many people refuse to believe it when they hear it for the first time. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you as much as it surprised Margaret herself. It all began on a seemingly ordinary morning. Margaret was in her kitchen, as usual, when she felt something different. It wasn't exactly pain, but a strange sensation she had never experienced before. Being a practical person who always took good care of her health, she decided to schedule a doctor's appointment. After all, at 72 years old, any new symptom deserves attention, right? What she didn't expect was that this routine checkup would turn into the most impactful moment of her entire life. When the doctor entered the room with that serious yet disconcerted expression, Margaret imagined it could be something serious. Cancer? Some degenerative disease? Her mind quickly raced through all the bad possibilities we usually imagine in these situations. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared her for what she was about to hear. The words that came out of the doctor's mouth simply didn't make sense. It was as if he were speaking in another language, describing a parallel reality that couldn't possibly exist in the real world. Margaret was pregnant. At 72 years old, after decades without menstruating, after raising her grown children and even meeting her grandchildren, she was expecting a baby. How is this possible? What would you do if you received such news? Modern medicine shows us rare and extraordinary cases that challenge everything we know about the human body and its limits, but living this reality is completely different from just reading about it. Siki. News hit Margaret like a bolt from the blue. She remained silent for long minutes, just staring at the doctor as if expecting him to say, "You're kidding." But he wasn't. The tests were there, clear and unequivocal. Her body, which she thought she knew so well after more than 7 decades of life, had retained this extraordinary capacity, this possibility that science considers almost a miracle. And now, what to do with such information? How to process something so gigantic, so unexpected, so completely outside of any plan she had for this phase of her life? Margaret left that doctor's office in a state of shock. Her hands trembled as she held the folder with the test results. The way back home seemed longer than ever. Each step carried the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. She thought about her children, now grown and independent. She thought about her grandchildren, some already teenagers. She thought about how her life had settled into a quiet retirement routine. And she thought, above all, if her body could handle it, if she would have the strength, if it made any sense at 72 to embark on this journey that she thought she had left behind so many decades ago. If this topic resonates with you, if this story is touching something deep inside you, leave a comment below about what has resonated with you so far. Tell us, do you believe it's never too late to start over? Have you ever experienced an unexpected twist in life that completely changed your plans? Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content that truly matters, that talks about real life, about genuine emotions, about stories that make us reflect on our own choices and limitations. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, click the subscribe button, because Margaret's story is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what happens next. Oh, and leave a like too, because every like helps us understand that this content is meaningful to you and motivates us to bring you even more inspiring stories like this one. But back to Margaret. She needed to tell someone. She needed to share this weight, this monumental surprise she was carrying alone. The first person who came to her mind was her eldest daughter, Sarah, 48 years old. How does a mother tell her adult daughter that she's pregnant? How does one explain the inexplicable? The conversation with Sarah was one of the most difficult of Margaret's life. They sat in the living room, and Margaret tried to find the right words, but there simply weren't any. When she finally managed to say, "I'm pregnant," the silence that settled between them felt like it weighed a ton. Sarah looked at her mother with an expression that mixed disbelief, worry, and something Margaret couldn't quite put her finger on. Was it fear? Was it anger? Or perhaps just profound shock at the impossible becoming real? Margaret had always been an ordinary woman, one of those who built their lives with hard work, dedication to family, and small everyday pleasures. She lived a life full of happy moments, but also challenges, until something changed. She married young, had 3 children, and worked for decades as a primary school teacher, shaping generations of children. Her husband passed away 8 years ago, leaving a void that she learned to carry with dignity. Retirement brought that peace that comes after a lifetime of responsibilities. She could finally wake up without an alarm clock, tend to her plants, visit her children, spoil her grandchildren. It was a tranquil, predictable existence without major upheavals until that morning at the doctor's office. Now I need to tell you a little more about who Margaret really was before this turning point, because understanding her journey up to this point is fundamental to understanding the magnitude of what was happening. Margaret had always been a person of routine, someone who found comfort in predictability. After her children grew up and left home, after her husband passed away, she built a new version of herself. A more solitary version, yes, but also a freer one. She learned to enjoy her own company, to value the silence of the empty house, to do things at her own pace. She traveled a few times with friends, dedicated herself to hobbies she had abandoned in the rush of motherhood. She painted watercolors, did volunteer work at the local library, participated in a reading group. Her life had purpose, it had meaning, it had balance. But now all of that would be put to the test. The news of the pregnancy wasn't just about having a baby. It was about completely rebuilding the identity she had spent years cultivating. It was about giving up her newfound freedom. It was about going back in time to a phase she thought she had definitively overcome. And the scariest part? Doing all of this alone, without a partner by her side, with a body that no longer had the same energy as before. What if the courage to start over was the true secret of youth? Comment below which moment in your life you would choose to relive if you had the chance to start over. The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster. Margaret oscillated between moments of acceptance and moments of absolute panic. There were days when she could imagine herself holding a baby again, smelling that unique newborn scent, and there were nights when she woke up in a cold sweat, terrified by the approaching reality. But what exactly happened that made her take such a courageous step? Because deciding to go ahead with a pregnancy at 72 isn't simply accepting a medical condition. It's choosing to embrace a radical transformation that goes against everything society expects of someone at that stage of life. Margaret spent entire nights staring at the ceiling, talking to herself, weighing every aspect of that impossible situation. And it was on one of those sleepless nights that something inside her changed. She recalled a conversation she had with her husband years before he passed away. They were sitting on the porch swing, watching the sunset, when he said something that stuck in her memory. "Margaret, life isn't about how much time we have, but about what we do with the time we are given." At the time, those words seemed like just a beautiful philosophical reflection. But now, facing this monumental crossroads, they had taken on a completely new meaning. It was as if the universe was testing whether she truly believed in it, or if they were just pretty words we repeat without thinking. The hidden truth behind Margaret's hesitation wasn't fear of others' judgment or physical difficulties. It was fear of hope. Yes, hope. Because after years of building a comfortable life within safe boundaries, after accepting that certain chapters were closed, allowing herself to dream again seemed dangerous. Hope means vulnerability. It means opening her heart to possibilities that could go wrong, and Margaret had spent too much time protecting herself from disappointment. But then came the turning point. Sarah returned to visit her a few days after that first difficult conversation. She arrived with red eyes, but with a different expression on her face. She hugged her mother for long minutes and whispered, "Mom, I was scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of what people would say. Scared of everything. But then I realized that you always taught us to live with courage, and if you're willing to do that, I'll be by your side." Those words were like opening a window in a room that had been closed for years. Margaret finally allowed herself to feel something she had suppressed: excitement. It was at that moment that her mindset completely changed. It was no longer about what she was losing or risking. It was about what she was gaining. A second chance to experience motherhood with a wisdom she didn't have when she was young. An opportunity to prove that the limits we place on ourselves are often just mental constructs. A chance to live an extraordinary journey that very few people in the world would have the opportunity to experience. Write in the comments, what was the biggest fear you've ever faced and overcome in your life? Margaret then began to prepare herself, not only physically, consulting medical specialists and adjusting her routine, but emotionally as well. She needed to rebuild her entire mental structure to accommodate this new reality that was about to become permanent. Emotional preparation was undoubtedly the most complex part of this entire journey. Margaret began attending a support group for high-risk pregnancies, where she met women much younger than herself, all facing their own challenges. At first, she felt completely out of place. The other women were in their 30s and 40s. She could be the mother, even the grandmother, of most of them. But over time, she realized that fear, anxiety, and hope have no age limit. They all shared the same vulnerability, the same silent strength that only those who are carrying a life can understand. It was during one of these meetings that Margaret met Linda, a volunteer who had also experienced a late pregnancy at 48. Linda didn't judge, didn't question, didn't show disbelief. She just listened. And after Margaret poured out all her insecurities, Linda said something profound. "Do you know the difference between having a child young and having a child later in life? When we're young, we think we know everything. When we're older, we know nothing, and that makes us better mothers." Those words touched a deep place within Margaret. But now I need to tell you about the moment that truly changed everything for her. The instant Margaret stopped fighting the situation and began to truly embrace it. It was one Sunday afternoon, when she was organizing the room that had belonged to her youngest son. She found an old box full of photographs, letters, and mementos from when her children were little. She spent hours there, leafing through yellowed albums, reading Mother's Day cards written in crooked handwriting and with childish drawings. And suddenly, a wave of emotion washed over her. She remembered what it was like to hold her babies for the first time. The smell, the delicate weight in her arms, that instant and overwhelming love that needs no words to explain. She remembered the sleepless nights, yes, but also the sunny mornings playing in the park. She remembered the first steps, the first words, the contagious laughter. And then she realized something fundamental. She was being given the chance to relive all of that, but this time with a completely different perspective. It was at that moment that she realized it's never too late to love again, to allow herself to feel intensely, to embrace the unknown with an open heart. Margaret cried that afternoon. She cried from longing, she cried from fear, but mostly she cried from gratitude. Gratitude for being alive, for being healthy enough for that journey, for having children who supported her, for having received that extraordinary opportunity that defied all odds. The impact of that inner revelation was transformative. She wasn't losing anything. She was gaining an additional chapter in a life that was already rich in experiences. From that moment on, Margaret stopped apologizing. She stopped explaining. She stopped seeking external validation for a decision that was deeply personal and intimate. She began telling other family members, close friends, and each conversation became easier. Each conversation revealed something interesting about the people around her. Some reacted with genuine shock, others with concern disguised as care, and a few with sincere admiration. Margaret quickly learned to distinguish those who truly cared about her well-being from those who simply wanted a scandalous story to tell. And you know what surprised her most? discovering that the judgment of others weighed much less than she imagined. Because when you make a decision truly aligned with your heart, external opinions lose their power. But making that definitive decision to move forward didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of internal reconstruction. Margaret needed to confront decades of social conditioning about what is appropriate for a woman her age. She needed to challenge her own limiting beliefs about ability, energy, and purpose. She decided that her life still had many chapters to be written, and this would perhaps be the most unexpected and extraordinary of all. It wasn't just about having a baby. It was about proving to herself that she was still alive, still capable, still had something valuable to offer the world. The truth is that Margaret went through a grieving process before reaching complete acceptance. Grief for the quiet life she was about to lose. Grief for her newfound freedom. Grief for the image she had of herself as a retired grandmother, not as an active mother again. But on the other side of this grief, she found something precious. Renewal. An energy she hadn't felt in years began to pulsate within her. It was as if her body and mind were waking from a long nap. Sarah became her greatest ally in this process. Together, they began preparing the house for the baby's arrival. They transformed the old office into a nursery, painting the walls a soft shade of yellow. Each brushstroke was an act of faith, a declaration that yes, this was really happening. Margaret bought tiny clothes, diapers, a modern crib very different from the ones she had used decades ago. And with each practical preparation, her confidence grew. There were moments of panic, of course. Nights when she woke up thinking about the behind-the-scenes aspects of this decision, the possible medical complications, the logistics of caring for a newborn at 72 years old. But there were also moments of pure joy, like when she felt the baby move for the first time. That sensation she had completely forgotten, that subtle movement that confirms there is life growing inside you. Margaret placed her hand on her belly and cried, not from sadness or fear, but from a deep connection with that being she didn't even know yet. What impresses me most about this whole journey is how Margaret completely transformed her mindset. She went from, "Why is this happening to me?" to, "This is happening for me." She went from being a victim of circumstances to the protagonist of an extraordinary story. The months went by, and Margaret adapted to the physical changes with a mixture of nostalgia and discovery. Her body was changing in ways she vaguely remembered from previous pregnancies, but now everything seemed amplified, more intense, more challenging. The backaches came earlier and with greater force. The tiredness was deep, visceral, unlike any fatigue she had felt before. Climbing stairs became a task that required planning. Sleeping comfortably turned into a nightly puzzle of pillows and positions. But Margaret faced each discomfort as part of a larger journey, a small price to pay for something so extraordinary. What she didn't expect was to face so many obstacles that came from the outside, not from within. Who would have thought that she, at 72 years old, would have to fight against so much prejudice to start over? The medical appointments were always tense. Some professionals treated her with condescension disguised as concern, repeatedly questioning whether she was sure of what she was doing. One doctor even suggested bluntly that she consider other options, using euphemisms that didn't hide what he really meant. Margaret listened to everything in silence, thanked him politely, and never returned to that office. Finding a medical team that respected her as a person capable of making her own decisions was surprisingly difficult. She visited 5 different obstetricians before finding Dr. Stevens, a professional in her 50s, who looked Margaret in the eye and said, "I will take care of you and your baby in the best way possible. That's your choice, and I respect that completely." Those simple words meant more than Margaret could ever express. But the judgments didn't just come from the medical system. They came from everywhere. At the supermarket, an old acquaintance commented loudly, "At your age, you should be thinking about resting, not diapers." At church, she heard whispers behind her back. Friends of decades distanced themselves, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Margaret discovered that people have very rigid ideas about what is appropriate at each stage of life, and challenging those norms bothers more people than she imagined. The physical limitations were real and undeniable. Margaret couldn't pretend she had the same stamina as when she had her other children. She needed help with tasks she used to do alone. Sleep became a rare luxury. Trips to the bathroom happened every hour. Her body constantly protested, reminding her that she was asking something extraordinary of it. But do you know what Margaret said when someone pointed that out? "My body is doing something miraculous. It deserves my respect, not my criticism." The stigma of age was everywhere. People automatically assumed she was a grandmother accompanying her pregnant daughter to appointments. Salespeople in baby stores ignored her, directing questions to Sarah. It took developing a thick skin, an emotional shield against the constant judgment coming from all directions. Comment below if you've ever had to face judgment from people for making a decision that went against what they expected of you. Despite all of this, Margaret kept going. Each obstacle overcome strengthened her a little more. Each prejudice faced made her more resolute. She realized that the strength needed to continue would not only come from within, but also from the connections she would create along the way. Margaret began actively seeking out people who understood her journey, who saw her as she truly was, and not through the lens of ageism. That's how she found an online group of mothers in late pregnancies, women of various ages, sharing experiences, fears, and victories. There, for the first time, she felt completely understood without needing to explain herself. But what really changed the game was when Margaret decided to stop hiding. She began to explore what she had always had inside her, an unwavering love for life, a curiosity that age hadn't extinguished, a desire to live intensely every moment she was given. She started going out more, accepting invitations she would have previously refused, allowing herself to experience new things. She enrolled in prenatal yoga classes, where she was clearly the oldest, but also the most determined. Each pose she managed to hold was a silent victory over the limitations others tried to impose on her. It was during one of these classes that she met Thomas, a 65-year-old widower who was there supporting his pregnant daughter. They started talking in the waiting room, and Margaret was surprised at how easy it was to talk to him. Thomas didn't judge, didn't question, didn't show shock. He just listened to her story with genuine interest and admiration. In subsequent meetings, they began having coffee together after school. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense, but it was connection. It was companionship. It was someone who saw Margaret as a complete and fascinating woman, not as a medical anomaly. These new friendships and connections brought something Margaret didn't know she was missing: lightness. For weeks, she had carried everything alone, with an enormous weight on her shoulders. But now, she had people to laugh with, to share small victories and difficult moments with. Thomas took her for light walks in the park. The women in the online group sent encouraging messages on bad days. Sarah was there for every doctor's appointment. Margaret realized that starting over didn't mean doing everything alone, but having the courage to accept help and build a new support network. She also rediscovered old hobbies and developed new interests. He returned to painting watercolors, but now his paintings had different themes, more vibrant, more full of life. He began documenting his journey in a diary, writing letters to the unborn baby, recounting this extraordinary adventure they were experiencing together. Each page was an act of love, a way to process everything that was happening and create tangible memories for the future. The purpose Margaret found went beyond motherhood. It was about proving that life has no expiration date, that the capacity for transformation doesn't expire, that love in all its forms can flourish in any season of existence. As the months passed and her belly grew, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. There were days when fear still visited her, usually in the quiet hours of the early morning when she was alone with her thoughts. But these moments were becoming increasingly rare, replaced by growing anticipation. Margaret was 7 months pregnant when something completely unexpected happened, something neither she nor her family could have foreseen. You won't believe what she did, and how everything fell into place in such an unexpected way. Thomas, who had become a close friend and confidant, invited her to dinner at his house. It was a quiet Saturday evening, and Sarah had encouraged Margaret to go, saying she deserved a break from the routine of doctor's appointments and preparations for the baby. When Margaret arrived, she found not only Thomas, but also his 3 adult children and even some of the grandchildren. Thomas had prepared a special dinner and, in the middle of the meal, did something that caught Margaret completely off guard. He stood up, asked for everyone's attention, and said he had a proposal to make. With touching sincerity, Thomas spoke about how meeting Margaret had changed his perspective on everything, about how her courage inspired him to live more fully, to stop merely existing and begin to truly live again. And then, before his own assembled family, he asked Margaret if she would marry him, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because he had fallen in love with the extraordinary woman she was, with her indomitable spirit, her ability to defy conventions, the way she embraced life even when life threw the most improbable challenges at her. Margaret was speechless. This was the last thing she expected. To marry again at 72, pregnant, about to have a baby. It seemed like madness upon madness. But when he looked into Thomas's eyes, he saw something genuine there. It wasn't someone trying to save or rescue her. It was someone who wanted to walk beside her, share the journey, be a partner in an adventure they both knew was extraordinary. And for the second time that surprising year, Margaret said yes to something that defied all logic. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, an intimate ceremony in Margaret's garden, with only close family and a few friends. She wore a simple dress that accommodated her 8-month pregnancy and held a bouquet of daisies from her own garden. Sarah cried throughout the ceremony, but they were tears of genuine joy. Thomas's children welcomed her with open arms, fascinated by the whole story and the example of courage she represented. The impact of this decision was profound. Margaret wasn't just having a baby. She was building a completely new family, a support structure that would transform everything. Thomas immediately assumed the role of an active partner, helping with the final preparations for the baby's arrival, accompanying her to appointments, holding her hand during moments of anxiety. Comment below what was the biggest surprise life ever gave you when you least expected it. Margaret was just a few weeks away from her due date when she began to feel her first contractions. It was a Tuesday morning when it all began. Margaret was having coffee with Thomas when she felt her first contraction. Unlike the discomforts she had been experiencing in recent weeks, she looked at the clock, took a deep breath, and said calmly, "I think it's today." Thomas, who had mentally rehearsed this moment dozens of times, immediately grabbed the bag that had been packed for weeks and called Sarah. The drive to the hospital was a mixture of tension and excitement, with Thomas holding Margaret's hand as he drove with excessive caution, avoiding every pothole in the road. The birth was closely monitored by a full medical team, all aware of the risks involved in such an atypical pregnancy. Margaret was surrounded by Sarah on one side, Thomas on the other, and Dr. Stevens coordinating everything with professionalism and empathy. The hours dragged on, each contraction testing the resilience of a body that Margaret feared wasn't strong enough, but it was. Her body, which so many had doubted, proved capable of performing this miracle. When the baby's cry finally echoed through the delivery room, Margaret felt a wave of emotion so intense she could barely breathe. It was a girl, tiny, perfect, with perfectly functioning lungs, loudly protesting the abrupt departure from the comfort of the womb. When they placed the baby in Margaret's arms, time seemed to stand still. 72 years of life had prepared her for many things, but not for the intensity of that moment. She looked at that wrinkled little face and saw not only a new life, but the confirmation that she had made the right decision. Today, 3 months after that life-changing day, Margaret lives with more vigor and happiness than ever, proving that it's never too late to start over. The house that was once silent is now filled with the sounds of babies, laughter, and lively conversations. Thomas has proven to be a present and dedicated partner, waking up in the early hours to help with feedings, rocking little Emma when she doesn't want to sleep. Sarah visits almost every day, marveling at her younger sister who is 48 years younger than her. The impact of this journey went beyond Margaret's immediate family. Her story began to circulate throughout the community, inspiring conversations about age, ability, and the limits we impose on ourselves. Older women sought out Margaret to share their own stories of postponed dreams and ignored possibilities. She unintentionally became a symbol that life can surprise us in extraordinary ways if we have the courage to embrace the unexpected. Margaret discovered that being a mother at 72 is completely different from being a mother in her 20s. She has patience she didn't have before, wisdom accumulated over decades, a perspective on what really matters in life. She doesn't worry about nonsense. She doesn't sweat the small things. She enjoys each moment with an intensity that only someone who has lived a long time can have. But this story still has more layers that need to be told. Revelations about what it truly means to start over when everyone expects you to just rest. What many people don't understand is that starting over doesn't mean erasing the past or pretending that previous decades didn't exist. Margaret wasn't trying to be young again. She was integrating all her life, experience into a new chapter that honored both who she was and who she was becoming. Every wrinkle on her face told a story. Every emotional scar had taught a valuable lesson. And now, all of that served as the foundation for this extraordinary phase. What I want you to understand about this journey is that it reveals something profound about human nature. We spend so much time constructing narratives about how our lives should be, about what is appropriate at each age, about which doors permanently close at certain times. But Margaret's story dismantles all these assumptions. It shows that the capacity for transformation has no expiration date, that the heart doesn't age in the same way as the body, that the spirit can remain young and open to possibilities, regardless of the years lived. Margaret began receiving letters and messages from people all over the world after her story was shared in a local newspaper article that went viral. Women in their 50s, 60s, and now 70s wrote, recounting abandoned dreams, relationships they didn't pursue, and changes they didn't make for fear of what others would say. They saw in Margaret not just a woman who had a baby at an advanced age, but a living example that it's possible to defy social expectations and live authentically. One letter in particular touched Margaret deeply. It was from a 68-year-old woman who had recently lost her husband and was convinced that her life was effectively over, that all that remained was to wait for the end. But after reading about Margaret, she wrote, "You made me realize that I was burying myself alive. Thank you for reminding me that I'm still here. I'm still breathing. I still have time." Margaret responded personally, and the two began a correspondence that blossomed into a friendship. This story shows us that no matter the age, there's always a new chance to love and be happy. And you? Are you ready to start over? I'm not necessarily talking about having a baby at 72, but about breaking the invisible chains that bind us to a limited version of ourselves, about questioning the internal and external voices that say, "You're too old, it's past time, this isn't for you," about recognizing that while there's life, there's the possibility of renewal. Margaret looks at Emma sleeping in her crib and feels overwhelming gratitude, not just for the baby, but for the entire journey that brought her here, for the challenges that strengthened her, for the doubts she overcame, for the people who appeared at the right time, for the love she found when she least expected it. What if the best chapters of your life are yet to come? Comment below which dream you still want to fulfill, regardless of your current age. But there's something else I need to tell you about this story, something that goes beyond the obvious and touches the core of what it truly means to live. The deepest truth that Margaret's story teaches us is that living fully requires a courage that goes far beyond what we imagine. It's not about grand heroic gestures or cinematic moments. It's about waking up every day and choosing to be present, to be open, to be willing to be surprised by life. Margaret could have refused this pregnancy. She could have chosen the easier, safer, more predictable path, but she didn't. And that choice changed not only her life, but touched hundreds of other people who needed to see that it was possible. Emma will grow up knowing she was deeply wanted, that her existence was a conscious and courageous choice, that her mother loved her so much she defied the whole world to bring her into the world. She will grow up in a home full of love, with a mother who has the wisdom of decades and a stepfather who chose to be there. She will have adult siblings who adore her and nephews and nieces who are older than her. You will grow up understanding that family is not about conventions, but about love and commitment. Margaret told me something in one of our conversations that I'll never forget. If I could go back in time and change anything, I wouldn't change a thing, because everything has brought me here, to Emma, to this life that I didn't even know was possible. That's the mindset of someone who truly understands what it means to live. It's not about avoiding mistakes or always getting it right, but about embracing the entire journey with all its unexpected twists and turns. So I want to leave you with this. Question: what are you putting off in your life because you think it's too late? What dream did you bury because someone said it wasn't appropriate for your age anymore? What version of yourself is waiting for permission to exist? Margaret's story isn't exceptional because she had a baby at 72. It's exceptional because she chose to live authentically, without apologizing, without hiding, without dimming her light so that others would feel comfortable. If you've made it this far, if this story touched you in any way, leave a comment writing, "It's never too late." Because when you write that, you're remembering this truth, you're committing to the possibility of transformation in your own life. And if this content made sense to you, click the like button, because that shows me I'm on the right track, bringing stories that truly matter, that inspire, that make you rethink your own choices and limits. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button, because I'll continue bringing you stories like this, real stories of people who defied the impossible and won. And there's a video over here that talks exactly about how to break down the mental barriers that prevent us from living life to the fullest. Click and stay with me there because this conversation is just beginning.